In this recording, I'm going to cover statics in object-oriented PHP. So that's a static keyword, static properties, static methods, and some practical use, and also something called late static binding. Before I get into that, a bit of information first. I record in high resolution, so there's no need to watch on a blurry screen. Choose high definition if that will work for you. Would you like to join a growing group of PHP developers and take your skills to a new level? If that sounds like you, all you need to do is subscribe and click the little notification icon, and welcome. The example I'm going to use in this one is that of an online conference. So inside the chapter 4 folder and inside the app folder, which is inside of that, I've created a folder called conference. Inside of that, I'm going to create a class called attendee, as in an attendee at a conference. And you'll notice that the namespace is following the same format as my folder structure. I'm going to start off with a static property first. So if you've done the properties lesson, you'll have seen this one already. I'm going to increment a count every time a new attendee is created. So the way we create static properties is like this: public, static, or it can be private or protected, but you must use the word static. And then it's going to be an integer, and I'm going to give it a default of 0. And then every time that an attendee is created, I'll just increment that count by doing self : count and then increment. And static properties belong to the class and not the object. I'll show you what I mean by creating a new attendee. So when I create this new attendee, the construct method is called, the count is incremented, and I access that count property off of the attendee class, not the Gary object. So let's go and test this out. Initially just running the file in my terminal, integer1. So I'll add another attendee, and we'll call this attendee Jackson. Run it again, and we have an integer 2. So the count is incremented when I add the second one. I'm going to make the property private, and as you can see, I've got the red squiggle under count, so this shouldn't work. I should get an error here. I cannot access a private property, and I've done that in order to demonstrate static methods. So I'm going to create a getter, much like any other getter that we've used to access private properties, except this one is going to be static because we're trying to access a static property. So I'll just spell this correctly: public static function get count, and then I change this access here to a call of the get count method. As you can see, also uses the double colon. Run it again, and we get integer of 2. So static methods are for where you might not have an object, or you might not need an object in order to perform certain functionality. Here's an example where I don't have an object instance of the class, but I'm going to use the class in order to create object instances of the class. And this is similar to a method which is used in the Laravel framework. By having a static create method on the class, I can create object instances of an attendee. So this first line, I new up an attendee, and I want it to have an ID and a username. The way I'll handle username is I'll pass it in with an array of attributes, and then I'll just assign it. So similar to a way that you might pass arguments into a constructor, I guess. So I'll set this username to the username key of the attributes array. I can't really do that with an ID because you can't guarantee that you're going to be giving it a unique ID if you did that by passing it in. So I need to somehow make the class responsible for creating its own ID and also recording which IDs have already been allocated to objects. So I've added a private ID property. It's not a static property, it's just a normal private property. How am I going to add a unique ID to this? The way I'll do that is by having a static property called nextID. I'll initialize it with 1. So the first attendee which I create will be given an ID of 1. After assigning it in the constructor, I then increment it so that the next object I create is always given the next ID. Important to make sure that this is handled in the constructor and not the create method. In the create method, all I need to do then is just return the attendee which I've created. So just to be clear on this, I new up an instance of attendee. That calls a constructor which increments the count. Then I assign the ID to the next ID static property, and then I increment that in order for the next object to take the next one. And then from the create method, I return the attendee. Let's go and try this out and see if it behaves as expected. So attendee : create. I need to pass in an array with a username key, and I'll just put Gary C for this. and then using print R, I'll just print this out, and we'll go over to terminal, check this out, and that has worked. Username Gary C with an ID of 1, and I don't suppose we'll know if it's really worked until we create our second one. So I'll duplicate this, and I'll create an attendee called Jackson, and username Jackson. We'll print that one out, and what we'll think we'll also do is print out a count to make sure we have a count of 2. So Jackson should have been given an ID of 2, and we should have a count of 2. And that is exactly what we get. Username Jackson, ID 2, and then our count at the bottom is 2. Perfect. In this final example, I'm going to show something called late static binding, which demonstrates another usage of the static keyword, except in the context of inheritance. And in this context, static refers to the class being called rather than that which the method was defined. So what I'm doing here is creating a registrant class, which is going to be the parent for the attendee. I'm going to make it abstract, and I'm going to give it a protected static property, which I will call meta, and it'll just hold metadata about the class. And I'm also going to define a static meta property in any classes which extend this one. So I'm going to create a host which extends registrant, as in the conference host. I'll add a static meta property to this, as I'll change it to conference host. And then I'm going to do the same thing in attendee, and I'll call this conference attendee. And this also needs to extend the registrant class. So I hope you've managed to follow that so far. I'm now going to go back to the registrant class. I'm going to add a getter for the meta, which rhymes. Public function get meta, and initially I'm going to return self : meta, because I want to demonstrate the difference between self and static and how late static binding works. So up to now we've just used this self : property name in order to access static properties. We're going to need a file to test this out, so inside the public directory inside the chapter 4 folder I'm going to create an index.php file. If you followed along from the previous lessons, you've probably already got an index.php file, so you can continue to use that one, or you can start with a fresh one like myself. I'm requiring once the autoload PHP file. If you don't have one of those already, it goes in the same public folder. I'll leave mine on the screen, just pause it and copy this. I'm just going to start off by creating attendee the way that we've done it before. Attendee : create. Need a username key for the array, and I'll just call it Gary C. If I had a use statement at the top of the file, it means I can refer to the attendee class just using the short name. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to the HTML, add a paragraph. I'll use PHP's short echo tags, and what I want to do is call the get meta method off of this Gary attendee which I've just created, and see what we get. I'm personally going to use PHP's built-in server, so I'm moving into the public folder where I shall start that up using PHP -S localhost followed by the port number. And then in PHP Storm, all I need to do is click on that address, and that will take me to the page. And as you can see, it's returning conference registrant. But the thing is, I called it through the Gary object, so really I want the metadata for my Gary object. The way I can do this is by changing the self keyword to static. By doing this, it will first look for a meta property on the calling class. Refresh, conference attendee. Let me also demonstrate this to you using the host, so I'll swap this out. Gary equals new host, because we didn't have a create method in host, if you recall. And so I'll add the use statement at the top, use host, which means I can simplify this. And then all I need to do is go back to the browser, refresh, and this time we get conference host. So static refers to the class being called. If it finds a meta property in there, it will use that. If it doesn't, what it would do, it would just go up to the registrant. It would use the meta property from that instead. So that's the static keyword, static properties, static methods, and also late static binding as a little bonus. Hope you found it useful. If you have enjoyed it, be sure to give it a like, and don't hesitate to share if you want to help other developers like yourself. That's what good developers do. And also, if you'd like YouTube to show you more of my content, all you need to do is subscribe and click the little notification icon. I release new recordings 2 times a week, and details of my schedule can be found on the discussion tab of my YouTube channel homepage.